You have to have a vision that's big enough that other talented people want to be a part of it. So that was the stress test. I've watched so many companies adopt EOS and they build it wonderfully and build a wonderful vision for them and their current leadership team and the size of that enterprise. But I believe you have to build a vision that is grand enough where other talented people can see their own success in it.
You're listening to RevOps Champions, a podcast created for B2B leaders to help you align your people, streamline your processes, trust your data, and leverage technology in order to grow your business. First of all, thanks again so much for agreeing and actually, I was kind of really happy that you were available at such short notice because I know you have a very busy schedule.
It was a miracle of Labor Day, I think, so it's good. Yeah,
good. So you're home at the moment, or are you traveling somewhere?
I'm in Minneapolis now, and then I'm going to leave. I'll be in Chicago for tomorrow through basically the end of Sunday.
Cool, nice, Luke. So one of the things I wanted to make sure I covered because, well, I guess for the listeners, I've been a client of Discover Strengths for on and off for 5 or 6 years. The good news is that the on part has been for the last 2.5 years since I recovered from some health issues, and my strength training, of course, has been one of the things that I always credit for being in better shape and being prepared for injuries that I wouldn't otherwise be. From a business perspective, one of the things, of course, that those of us who know Discover Strength and have been following Discover Strength for a while, the exciting part of that you've done here in the last couple of years is franchising. How's it been taking a business and starting franchising? Or maybe we should start with how did you decide to franchise?
Yeah, so franchising aligns with kind of the way we think about business and all of the things that I was uniquely passionate about. Now, the real impetus was reading a book. That's the impetus for everything for me. I bought the book, How to Franchise Your Business or Franchising Your Business. And I'm like halfway into the book and I'm thinking, shoot, this is inevitable. We're going to franchise now. But really, when I say it was connected to how I thought about business and what I was passionate about, forever, I've been passionate about developing exercise professionals. And I've been passionate about developing leaders, managers, entrepreneurs, business owners. And what I found myself doing is so much of that development outside of Discover Strength. Of course, we developed all of our exercise professionals, but I spent so much time speaking at exercise conferences, and I spent so much time, literally on a plane every week, teaching around business and leadership and management and strategy and these wonderful topics. But they were all to business owners, operators, leaders, and managers in every other conceivable industry. And I thought, well, why don't we do all that in our own system? And so if you're not interested in doing that, I don't think you can build a great franchise. And so for me, it was like, well, I'm already into that. That's what I want to spend my life doing. And so I think it lends to franchising. And then the other key, Brendon, is we had good unit economics, and you should not think about franchising unless you have good unit economics. And there's a lot of franchise companies that have a great idea for a product or a service. They haven't figured out the unit economics, but they say, hey, the idea is hot right now. We got to go and we can probably sell this. And they are able to sell it. Then the reality is they scale to a degree, and maybe this is the wrong terminology, but it's a house of cards. Right, no one's actually making money. You see the brand popping up everywhere, but none of those franchisees are making money. And of course, that's going to be a short-lived brand if no one's making money. So you have to figure out unit economics. We had many, many years of making unit economics work. And I have a wonderful financial leader, Jessica, who said, we are such a franchisable business in terms of our unit economics.
Yeah, that's funny because I just, in my last recording, I believe Ryan Tansom too. I had him on the podcast recently, and unit economics came up there too, which I guess is not a surprise. So, and what have been, so how long has it been now since you've been on the franchise trail?
Yeah, our first franchise opened about 2.5 years ago. So we had 2 open 2.5 years ago. We actually built out the franchise. We probably wrapped up building out the franchise a full 3.5 years ago. But the timing was that when we wrapped all that up, the pandemic was just starting. And so we were delayed in awarding our first franchise probably by a good 6 months or 8 months. So it was this time 4 years ago. Well, we're in 2024, 5 years ago, where we had a lot of consultants in town working with us and understanding our processes and creating FDDs and things like that. And that went on for months. We were really ready to go February 2020. And of course, the world shut down a month later. And so didn't change our conviction this was the right thing to do. And especially after a few weeks when we realized, hey, brick and mortar will be a thing going forward. So we had conviction that we can still do this. And actually, the pandemic created a lot of disruption in our industry where the really strong players, a lot of them didn't really survive. And so coming out of that, I think we were maybe even better positioned to start franchising and growing.
Yeah, and I know at that time you were also really quick to take the business online, which of course at that point, like so many other businesses, seemed like how would you do personal training online? But you figured it out, and I know we could probably do an entire episode on that. But for now, let's keep going down the more exciting future versus thinking about the past. So what would you say are the fundamental things that have changed in the last 2.5 years since you went from being at that point you were how many locations that were fully owned?
When we franchised, we owned 6 locations. And so that's where we were. And so we had I guess about 14 years of operating experience where we slowly grew to 6 locations.
Yeah. And like prior to the light bulb moment of we have to franchise, which obviously was there was going to be a huge shift in how you ran the business, because up until that point you were running a business where you thought you would just keep opening another location and another one and another one. But what has really changed from a business perspective since you embarked on the franchise model?
Well, that's a wonderful question. And the first answer is, well, it's a new business, right? It is learning a new business. We've always been in the fitness business, brick and mortar fitness business, boutique studio business. Well, franchising is a totally new business. And so there was excitement in learning a completely new business. But we were told that multiple times. This is a completely new business. And it is a completely new business. And so the biggest thing that changed is, well, it's a new corporation for us. And we needed to understand, first of all, how do we make our current business franchisable? And then how do we start talking about and marketing this franchise opportunity? How do we sell the franchise opportunity? How are we selling it to the right franchisee? I mean, the key to success of any franchise system is, are you awarding the right franchisees? And a lot of times we refer to it as sell, but it's really award. And we wanted to be really selective on who we awarded a franchise to, because we want to have wonderful franchisees. Wonderful franchisees create wonderful businesses with wonderful customer experiences that drive great unit economics. And so the big change was we had to learn that business. The second big change is now we have partners, right? Before, we have a lot of employees, and that's a relationship that I think is a sacred relationship. Value that relationship immensely, but these aren't your employees. You can't tell them what to do. They're your partners. Now, there's a brand standard that you are collectively trying to withhold, but they are operating their own business. It is their own capital. And of course, they expect a return on that capital. It's just a new relationship for us. So the two answers for me is we had to learn a new business, and then we had to be intentional about what kind of relationship do we want to have. And related to that is we wanted to be intentional about what type of franchisor do we want to be. So I loved going to franchise conferences early on, understanding all of these different franchise companies that are out there. How are they doing things? How are they creating rapport with their franchisee? And then we had to have a lot of internal discussion. Well, what do we want to build? Which was really fun because I haven't built something new in a very long time. And so to be able to take a step back and be inspired by brands like McDonald's. I mean, I could care less about McDonald's until we started franchising. And I read every book on McDonald's and fell in love with McDonald's. I hadn't eaten at McDonald's in literally 20 years. And I'm reading this McDonald's book and I think I need to go to McDonald's right now and have my first McDonald's in 20 years. So it's been wonderful to be influenced by some of these wonderful franchise organizations to help us understand, well, what are we trying to build?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what makes them successful, right? Which I guess is probably a good time to mention, what, like the premise of this show, the thesis of this podcast is why do some companies scale better than others. Now, that's obviously not necessarily specific to franchises, but you could essentially ask the same question, why do some franchises scale better than others? And I think you've already touched on a lot of the reasons for that. Is there anything specific that you've learned, over the last, let's say, 3 years and 2.5 years more specifically, about what will make a franchise more successful, one franchise more successful than another?
Yeah, so we're pretty early into understanding that question. So I know what makes a Discover Strength location successful in terms of, hey, is this individual franchisee gonna be successful? Before I answer that, I love to have just more data points, right? I love to have more locations open and we can really have a data-driven answer. I mean, early on, we know it's like they have to be in the right location. And so we spend a tremendous amount of money on analytics, understanding where should our locations be. And this goes back to, we wanted to be intentional about what type of franchisor do we want to be. We heard complaints all the time from franchisees that, hey, my franchisor, the only time they ever come visit me is because they're there to pressure me to buy another franchise and open it up. And if I didn't buy another franchise and open it up, they were going to sell it to somebody else. And suddenly in this given market, we have, whatever the concept is, whether it's donuts or exercise or whatever the concept is, there's one like on every other block. And that actually wasn't consistent with each one of those franchise locations being successful, having strong unit economics. And so investing in like a great analytics tool. I mean, we over invested in the analytics tool to understand where should a location be, what's too close, are we in a location where the franchisee can make money? So that's number one. Number two is are we awarding the right franchisee? And that's what we don't have total clarity on yet. Like, we have incredibly high caliber franchisees, but 10 years from now, I'll be able to tell you, well, it's this exact profile that actually, runs a more successful franchise. Right now, we're thrilled with the caliber of our franchisees, but some of the things on their background and their resume, their skill set, beyond being aligned with our values and our purpose, some of those things are really impressive. They might not be the key to running a wonderful franchise location. So those are things we don't know yet. And then lastly, and anyone you talk to in franchising will say this, is an interest and a commitment to running the play, right? A franchise involves a playbook and you have to run the play. And so sometimes an owner can be almost too entrepreneurial or not understand where to channel or how to channel that entrepreneurial drive. And they're channeling it into trying to change systems and processes that are really core to the business. Now, let's be clear, you have to fidelity to those processes and to that playbook. I mean, you have to be maniacal about operations. At the same time, most of your innovations as a franchise system grows is going to come from franchisees. So it's an interesting balance there. Like, the great breakthroughs come from franchisees, but at the same time, if a franchisee is not following and running the play, you have to go berserk over that, right? Like, you have to go berserk over that because that's the consistency of the brand. And I learned early on that when we open a franchise location, I would walk in there and I would see something going on in that location that really wasn't up to brand standards. And of course, my eyes went right there and it drove me crazy. And I would walk outside of that unit thinking, thank goodness that we don't own that. That's not my problem. And I realized pretty quickly, it is my problem. Like, the customer that's going there, they don't know who owns it. I think about when I go to stay in a lot of hotels. I've stayed in a lot of Courtyard Marriott hotels, stayed in a lot of Marriott properties as a whole. When I walk into that hotel and there's something wrong or there's something wonderful, I don't say, hey, who owns this? Is this a franchise location? Is this corporate owned? I just think it's the Marriott. And so I'm going to judge the Marriott. And so I realized pretty quickly, every Discover Strength is, my Discover Strength, even if it's not my Discover Strength. That's how I have to think about it, because that's how the consumer thinks about it. So that last key bullet is someone willing to truly run the play, fidelity to the play.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, and then without mentioning names, and you've done a lot of research about franchises. So outside of Discover Strength, you've attended conferences and events and whatever, where you're learning from the successes and failures of other franchise brands. What have you seen so far that leads to, I mean, you mentioned McDonald's earlier, but and obviously they've been incredibly successful, but what are some of the mistakes that you see franchisors make that lead them to be less successful than the really successful franchises that we see, like you say, on every corner.
Yeah, and in my opinion, I love that you framed the question that way. Is I sometimes learn or internalize learning better by thinking about the failures, or when I think about what do I want to build, one of my first considerations is what do I not want to build. And so when I sat down with our leadership team and everyone that works as a part of Discover Strength franchising, we got together and we said, well, what do we want to build and become as a franchisor? And before we could take stabs at that, we had to share what do we not want to become. So I had the news articles, I had slide after slide of examples of franchisors that probably didn't do it right. And some of it was, I just don't want to operate a business that way. And some of it was, hey, they're in like a legal entanglement over operating this way. So we wanted to share that as inspiration of we want to be the antithesis of that. And so the things that we learned, number one, from McDonald's, and I read this over and over and over. And frankly, I thought it was so incredibly obvious that it just didn't seem like a great learning. But then you start to learn about the franchise world and it's not obvious. It's that your obsession has to be with the success of the franchisee. You have to be absolutely obsessed with their unit economics. And so we have this priority list of the things that we're focused on, our philosophy as a franchisor. And number one is unit economics for our franchisee. If we're not obsessed with our franchisee making money and in fact becoming millionaires, we are not doing our job. So that's number one. Now, I say that out loud now, and it just sounds so obvious, but as I started to read like McDonald's and Ray Kroc's approach, it was just stated literally 100 times, well, this is what made Ray Kroc different. He looked at this as a partnership and an ecosystem where everybody had to be successful. So, and I'm going to go a step further. The franchisee had to be successful. The vendor had to be successful. And he never looked at a vendor as a vendor. He looked at it truly as a vendor-partner relationship. They had to be successful. And then, of course, McDonald's, corporate had to be successful. The whole ecosystem had to be successful. And to me, before reading that, I looked at a vendor partnership as transactional, right? We're going to buy equipment or this technology platform from this vendor. If we can get a different price, we're going to go, elsewhere. McDonald's was just so different in the early days. They, and McDonald's made a lot of vendors a lot of money. And those vendors understood, okay, I need to innovate on behalf of McDonald's. I mean, they had a vested interest in McDonald's growth. And so we have been largely influenced by that. So I think that's the second thing. The first thing is an obsession with unit economics. The second is, do you look at the whole ecosystem as everyone has to be successful and everyone has an equal part? And then you have to operationalize that, right? There's so many tactics and so many business decisions connected to that. But if you come to like our annual franchise convention, there's no hierarchy, right? When we're at a big dinner with hundreds of people in the room and we have speakers and at night there's a dinner and celebration and so forth, you're going to see a member of my leadership team sitting next to a vendor partner, sitting next to one of our exercise professionals, sitting next to a brand new franchise owner. We're just going to kind of be spread out. And that is one just tiny example of every part of the ecosystem we look at as equal place at the table.
Oh yeah, I mean, the way that, I'm not sure if that was intentional or not, but the way that that analogy worked out really well. Like you literally have people sitting around the table, and they all play a critical part. I mean, we've seen that. We work with a number of franchises, and again, when they first come to us, whether HubSpot brought them to us or whether they came to us directly, one of the first challenges we saw early on was that they really struggled with what you just said. And in most cases, they were over-indexing on just selling franchises, which meant that they were actually forgetting about the final customer, and all their websites, their marketing, communication, etc. was all. And I'm sure you've been through this, where you went to their branded website. The website was there to sell a franchise, not to actually bring customers into their franchises, businesses.
And if you visited their home office, Brendon, what you'd realize is all of their excitement, all of their ambition is connected to selling more franchises, right? It's not how is the franchisee doing, and it's not how is the end user, what's that customer experience like? And that's a misplaced ambition in my opinion. And so that connects to my other kind of big observation. And it sounds like a cliche, but there's just so many data points for it. It's long game thinking, right? The successful franchisors have this long game approach. And I think that's true of any entrepreneur. Like, he who can play the longer game, I think, is going to always win. And this is in building a brand. This is in how you cultivate customer relationship, franchise relationships, vendor relationships. But we have to think long term or long game. And I think a lot of times we trade short-term revenue, or we trade long-term revenue for short-term revenue. And we think more about, well, how do we optimize over the next year rather than what's going to put the brand in a great spot for 3 years and 10 years. So I think long game thinking is a commonality among the successful franchisors. I think about like Chick-fil-A, interesting model. Truett Cathy said, we're going to open 70 stores a year, where everyone else said, you could do 400 stores a year. And he said, no, we can't. We have the money to do it, but 70 stores a year is all we can do, where we're still hiring wonderful people and delivering the Chick-fil-A experience. And so he had an innate sense of how fast can we grow to be able to deliver that experience. And if your only mindset is growth at all costs and award more franchises at all costs, at some point the experience is going to be compromised.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that, because where I was going, and I think it's still relevant, is one of the reasons I think that so many franchisors or franchise brands get so stuck on just selling franchises is often because they haven't done the unit economics properly, and they might be running into cash flow issues or whatever the case may be, because they weren't clear on what the unit economics were up front, and of course probably maybe weren't as clear with their initial franchisees what success looked like, and just communication in general, I guess, is so critical, right? Especially with those first franchisees, and then you're obviously iterating and strengthening that over time, knowing what franchisees are looking for, because they don't have the knowledge that you have about the history of the business, right?
Yeah, everything you said is spot on.
Yeah. So, but ultimately, and we see this a lot, is unit economics seems to have very little to do with customer experience. But when you think about those, they're actually really two sides of the same coin. You cannot achieve a great customer experience if you haven't figured out the unit economics, and it's unlikely you'll meet the unit economics if you're not providing a great customer experience.
Yeah, I've always subscribed to this idea popularized by Fred Ray Kroc, who's the creator of Net Promoter Score, Net Promoter System. And before he called it Net Promoter Score, what he originally wanted to call it was Net Lives Enriched. And the terminology that he uses, and he's at Bain, people at Bain created it, and he calls it earned growth. So the idea that we are growing revenue, not because we've grown via acquisition, or we've just pumped more money into marketing, which is wonderful, but earned growth means you deliver a customer experience where that customer derives so much value that they can't help but come back and bring their friends with them, right? That's the idea of earned growth. And so at the end of the day, if the customer experience isn't right, you're going to suffer in terms of retention, right? You're going to have a churn problem, and you're not going to drive referrals. And we think one of the strengths of our brand is we've always been able to drive more new business and more referral with a lower marketing spend. Now, we still spend money on marketing, but every business's best customers come from referrals. We want to make sure we can operationalize how we're actually earning those referrals.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot. We use the bow tie funnel. Are you familiar with the bow tie funnel?
No. Talk me through that.
So it's essentially when you look at the classic sales and marketing funnel, which obviously still needs to happen in every business, you turn it on its side, and in the middle where the bow tie would be is where they become a customer. But then you have a whole another funnel on the other side, which creates the bow tie, which essentially is how do you treat a customer once they become a customer, so that you're always increasing and improving lifetime value.
Well, I love
of each customer.
I love that.
Yeah, and we actually had recently an expert in customer service from HubSpot who was, one of the statistics she shared with us was that you get a 25x higher return on that investment than you do on sales and marketing is incredibly expensive, and I know you know this, but again, for the folks listening, I think a lot of businesses, we still see that today. They just still fall into this, I guess, gap of we just let's focus on net new, not realizing that, like the saying goes, the best customers are the ones you already have, right?
Yeah. Horst Schulze, who's a longtime president for the Ritz Carlton Hotel Company, he would always say in a keynote, I heard him say it years ago, he said, there's only 4 components to running a successful business. And when he said that, I perked up because I thought, well, I think I've read like 300 business books in the last however many years. And each one of those business books, suggests 10 key ideas. How can there only be 4? And he said, 1, retain the customer. 2, earn more customers. 3, earn more revenue from existing customers. And 4, reduce your expenses. He said the key to those 4 is you can't screw up the order of importance. Number 1 is retain the customer. And I think so many leaders lose sight of that.
Yeah. Which, of course, is a message for any business, right? It's whether you're a franchise business or not. So I guess sort of going back to, again, and I know you shared earlier, and I love the way that you answered the fact that you don't yet have enough data to fully answer the question, because you only have 2.5 years worth of data. And I know your data model is obviously is growing exponentially, because the rate at which you're opening franchises, of course, is increasing in a non-linear fashion. But how have your systems changed? Going from essentially a single business owning and running all its own locations to now essentially having this multifaceted, what we call B2B to C model, where you have this critical key relationship with your franchisee partners, as well as of course your own employees, and driving customer value across the entire brand.
Yeah. So my 2 answers to that question are, number 1, we need more systems for relationships or transactions that we just didn't have before. So how are we interacting with a vendor and a partner? We didn't have that before. How are we interacting with a franchise owner? But then are we building the systems and processes for not just the franchise owner, but for their general manager and for their frontline staff, which for us, our frontline staff is an educated exercise physiologist. And so we had to build the systems and processes for all of those different levels to be successful. And then, like I said, we need to build the systems and processes so we can be a great franchisor. So that was a lot of new territory for us. We knew how to deliver the core customer experience, and that was always in a process. And that process we always iterate, but it's we felt we had a really good handle on that for years. I mean, I read Michael Gerber a year before we opened the first Discover Strength, and I thought, he always said, build the business like you're going to franchise it. You don't have to franchise it, but that's how tight your system should be. I thought, okay, that's what we need to do. And so I was very influenced by that early on. The second part of this answer is we realize, and again, this sounds like a cliche, but when you're living it, it's not a cliche. It is like our obsession is systems, processes have to be simple. Like if they're not simple, the whole system is just not going to follow them. And so a lot of times we love to solve a problem, like at the leadership team level, the solve is so incredibly complicated, and we can run with it because the 5 of us sat in a room and figured it out, and we could execute on it. But when it actually trickles down through the entire system, is everyone in the system going to be able to operate on it, right? Is the owner going to be able to understand it? The general manager going to be able to manage around it? Is the exercise physiologist going to be able to bring it down to the ground? And so we just realized that we always have to dumb down our systems. I mean, the systems and processes have to be simple. And I know there's 1,000 different books and speakers that speak to that, but that's definitely our obsession. And I actually think it's my observation that when you have really bright people, a lot of times they struggle with that. And my pushback to so many of my people is, you built that for you. But this has to be for the entire system, and they don't have the same level of engagement as you do on this problem or this topic right now. They have to be able to access it in a learning management system or in a core process on in a Google Drive quickly and efficiently, and build it in their business. Our education team that onboards our franchises, they need to be able to teach this to people that have no experience with it. So in a nutshell, simplicity is key.
Yes. Absolutely. We hear that all the time. And of course, I totally agree.
And when we think about simplicity, we think it has to be as simple as possible without watering down the key elements that make the brand what the brand is. And I've seen a lot of brands try to simplify and they lose the actual essence of the brand. And so we want to make things as simple as possible, but not any simpler. Like we can't go any simpler because then we lose the very essence of the brand.
Good point. I guess so. The other thing, of course, coming back to the central thesis for what we talk about on RevOps Champions, again, all about why some businesses scale better than others. One of the reasons I'm sure you made that decision to franchise was because of the scalability of the business and the brand. With scale, of course, as we talk about very frequently on the show, scale also brings challenges, right? So what would you say have been some of the biggest challenges related to scaling a lot faster than you were before?
Yeah, I mean, so early on, we always looked at it as capital. When you franchise, we still need capital, but the capital to launch a studio is supplied by the franchisee. So you kind of solve the capital there, but any franchisor will tell you that whatever you think it's going to cost to start building infrastructure, multiply it by about 10. There's just significant investment involved in building the infrastructure to support the franchisees. And so the first struggle is infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, it's understanding, well, how do we deploy capital at this stage? What's the next step of that infrastructure right now? Where do we get ROI if we spend money on this right now? There's a lot of things you can do. How do we make sure we're not too early or we're not too late on some of this investment? And that investment could be in a technology platform. It could be in people. It could be in process. And so making sure that you understand like what's your roadmap of what's most important right now to support the system, and is that balanced with revenue growth, right? You can build out a lot of infrastructure and spend a lot of money, but if it's not paired with revenue growth, that clearly doesn't work. So I think that's one of the big struggles. The second big issue is how do you actually take whether you call it the culture or the core ideology or the DNA, the ethos of an organization, and how do you start to spread that across the entire system? And so what I've been acutely aware of and frankly afraid of is I don't want to become, this is my analogy, a church without a religion, right? There's religion and there's church. And so we have to make sure that religion, and by religion is just your way of doing things, right? Whether it's culture or ideology or how you actually interact with a customer, how do you make sure that doesn't change as you start to scale? And that's the part that no matter what, it takes time. And maybe it speaks to Truett Cathy's quote around, I could do 70 in a year and that's it. Otherwise, we start to lose what Chick-fil-A actually is. And so that's been a struggle as well, where when it's locations that we own and there's a limited number of locations and you're not scaling fast at any given time of your staff, there's a high percentage of them that have been around for a long time and you've spent time with them and that DNA is they've connected with it. Well, as you grow, I look at our total headcount across the entire system, and now there's a massive percentage of that headcount that's brand new in the last 2 years. And I think, well, you guys don't know how we do things around here. So we have to be really intentional about how do we share that. And it can't be one PowerPoint for 1 hour where it's all downloaded and someone gets it. It's the stories, it's the analogies, it's connection to founder, it's stories like hero stories of when values were lived, and this stuff just takes time. And so you have to be intentional about how are we going to make sure the religion continues to exist as we build more churches. Building the church is the easy part, I think. But if you're going to build a great brand, the religion, and excuse my mediocre analogy, the religion is more important than the church is. And you have to be more intentional, I think, about what that religion looks like when you scale. And you have to balance that with this long game approach, right? I had heard, a million years ago, it's all about first to market. And we've all heard that. And then years later, I heard, and it's not about first to market, it's first to scale. And now I don't even believe that's the case. I believe it's first to market, first to scale. It's who can scale, and then who's scaled with this long game thinking where we're still going to invest in the customer experience. And in a franchise world, we're still going to be obsessed with unit economics. And so when the dust settles and you're 8 years in or 15 years in, are you starting to look at a company that's truly been built to last? And in the franchise world and in so many other industries outside of franchising, we see companies that are built for equity events of some kind. And I think, can you build a company that's really built to last? And you get a level of scale that's needed for the equity event. But beyond that, when the dust settles, what did someone acquire? What's the strength of the brand? And that just goes back to the built to last mentality or long game mentality.
So, Luke, I've known you for a long time, and I know one of the things that people who know you know is that you're very intentional, very deliberate about how you make all these things happen in your company, right? And I believe you still run on EOS. Is that correct? Yep. I know, because whenever I go to my workouts, the proven process is on the wall, and you obviously you have core values, etc. Were any of your like your proven process, your core values, so those critical parts of the operating system that you use to essentially maintain your religion, continuing that analogy, were any of those tested as you made the shift to franchise?
Yeah, what a wonderful question. We had to make sure they were tested, and we had to make sure, does this resonate with the rest of the system? And by the rest of the system, I mean potential franchisees. And so when we talked about core values or core purpose, or even something like a BHAG, a long-term goal, and then when we think about strategy or differentiation or strategic anchors or three uniques, does the rest of the system, are they aligned with this? And so, I think that you have to have a vision that's big enough that other talented people want to be a part of it. So that was the stress test. I've watched so many companies adopt EOS, and they build it wonderfully and built a wonderful vision for them and their current leadership team and the size of that enterprise. But I believe you have to build a vision that is grand enough where other talented people can see their own success in it. And to answer your question specifically, it's worked really well with franchising, right? People that have a really grand vision and have a vision of success for themselves, they can see that success inside of the entire kind of Discover Strength vision. But we had wonderful conversations around, is this still relevant? Are our core values relevant as we move to franchising? Is this purpose relevant as we move to franchising? And of course, we found out that, yeah, it's relevant. Now, the franchisee will still have to pick things like, what's our 1-year goal? What's our 1-year plan? And what's our 3-year picture look like? But for the most part, we say the vision component applies to the entire brand, the entire system.
Mm-hmm. And I guess so. What I'm hearing you say is that you didn't really have to make any changes to your existing vision, which of course is just further proof that you were still on the right track, right?
Yeah. Yep. Correct.
Good stuff. So you already talked a little bit about, obviously you've throughout the Discover Strength brand, you've added a lot of people in the last 2 years, but it sounds like you're coping really well with the potential challenges that can bring again, because that's one of the common challenges that come around scaling faster is you're adding people, which means you need a lot more training. You need much simpler training. But to your point, you also need to make sure you maintain all the key elements and essence of what it is that everybody needs to know.
And of course, that involves the technical training, the technical onboarding, but also the cultural onboarding. How do we, and related to that, how do we make sure that as we scale in terms of headcount across the system, how do we make sure that employment experience is intentional? I don't want to talk, and pound my chest about how great our employment experience is for years and years and years. And then I think, oh, you know what? We've really grown in terms of size. And I don't know what the employment experience is like, across the country at a lot of these locations. And I like to think that it's positive, but do we have systems and processes? And is there a way to inspect what that experience is like? It's just fundamentally important. If you care about that, and we care about that. I have more ego attached to our customer experience and our employment experience than I have ego attached to how many units have we awarded or how many units do we have open.
Right. So, and one of the other areas that of course continuously has to be iterated when you're scaling faster than the average business is, of course, process, right? So your processes are always iterating because they have to evolve as your business grows. And you started to talk about a little bit about, and I really like this approach. In fact, I love this approach where your processes, what I was hearing you say is they have to be run manually first, so we know that what the process is, and then we'll figure out if and when it makes sense to bring that into a system that, some form of technology. How has that looked over the last couple of years, as again your processes have evolved and continue to evolve? How do you approach then bringing those processes and automating as many of those that can be automated without losing that personal touch into your systems?
What a wonderful question. And sometimes the personal touch is incredibly important. Sometimes the personal touch is less important, and it's just much easier to turn to technology as a solution. So I think you're right. We have to understand what is the process, and then what's the right technology platform to help us automate this or streamline it or make it more efficient. And this is in every aspect of the business, from how we market to how we onboard to like let me give you one onboarding example. At what points does a new employee, when can they, on their laptop at home, watch a learning management system video of me talking about something, or one of our people, our education team, talking about something as they work through all these courses? And at what juncture do they actually need to have a live human in front of them talking about that concept? Because there's this temptation that you could put it all in a learning management system, for example, and they would just go home and literally interact with their computer, and that's how they would learn. So that example applies to every facet of the business. Then I think for us, what we've tried to do is we've tried to always rifle shot, and that's a Jim Collins term. It just means you got to test something in a smaller sample set before you roll it out. And so we've tried to do that with any technology shift. Is, well, let's not have the whole system jump onto this. Let's just have our corporate locations experiment with it first. And instead of all of our corporate locations, let's pick a couple locations, roll it out to that customer base or that staff base. Let's get 6 months with a little bit of a rifle shot. And then we can decide, is this something we want to, fire the cannonball and launch across the entire system? And that's always been important. That's always been our approach. It's more important right now when we turn to a franchisee and we say, hey, here's the new technology platform that's going to be a part of your tech stack, and you got to pay for it, but here's the use case for it. It's like we tested it 6 months. Here's the kind of data we saw. We think we have a big enough sample size to say there's going to be great ROI in introducing this. I think the mistakes that we've made is, we've had times where we've tried to roll out a technology or a system across the entire company, and we find out it didn't work, and now we have to, everybody has to kind of panic and shift back to something else. Or we've invested in a technology platform or solution and signed on for a period of time, right, for a few years at a really, really good rate, not understanding that maybe that platform is trying to get their hooks in us, and once that initial 2-year, 3-year deal is up, they understand that switching costs are high, and we're not going to switch off of their platform, and suddenly the price skyrockets. And so we've had a lot of naivety in understanding how to manage some of those relationships and make sure that if we need to pivot away from a platform, we could, or what kind of longer term commitment are we getting into with a given vendor partner. And that's just naivety on my part or my team's part.
Well, yeah, I mean, we have to learn some things the hard way, right? That's just life, especially if we're trying to, break through new frontiers and lead something in some way. We have to take some of the shots, I guess. Wow. So you covered a lot of good stuff there. I heard a lot of sort of 80-20 type stuff there, which of course is great. So, when you're looking at doing something, or like the training example that you gave, I guess it's probably an 80-20. So where maybe 80% of the training can happen through an LMA, but there has to be 20% roughly that still has to be done in person, and each business or leadership team has to figure out what is that 20% that needs to be done in person, and what is the 80% that can be done, in a more asynchronous way using technology. But then on the sort of the technology sort of implementation sort of stuff that you were talking about. So I like that sort of the rifle shot analogy. What we typically do with bigger organizations where there's, whether it's 250 or 500 or 1,000 people, again, they've all learned, and we've learned with them, again, the hard way, that you never do a full rollout or implementation unless there's a really, really good reason to do it, which means that they've already learned a lot of other things by making lots of other mistakes. But what we'll typically do in that situation is a pilot, right? So if it's in the case of a franchise business, we'll do a pilot with just one location or one franchisee, test it, make sure, then move on to the next one, and then when everyone feels good, then roll it out to the entire organization. Or if it's a single brand or a single business, not non-franchise, we'll do the same thing. If they have a sales team of 50 or 100 people, we'll ask for 5 volunteers, do a pilot, roll it out, do the training, and then the rest of the rollout then is so much more successful because there's already trust in what is being done, and then everybody else gets excited about the success that that first pilot group is having, right?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I love that approach.
What else is there? Well, actually, we probably had a good point here to start wrapping up. So I'm going to ask you two questions, Luke. I know, and everybody who knows you, you're an avid reader. What are one or two books right now that may or may not be related to what we've been talking about that you would recommend our listeners check out?
Wow. Okay. Yeah. This is one of my favorite questions. Brendon, I look at a book recommendation from a respected friend or colleague, like it's cherished. So when someone says, here's a book that you need to read, and I respect that person, have a relationship with that person, that is really powerful to me. So I'm in the middle of another Chick-fil-A book right now. It's a wonderful book. I'm not going to recommend that specific book. Let me go back a couple of years and say that an underrated book that is massively influential for me is Beyond Entrepreneurship 2.0. And that's written by Jim Collins. And that book is strange. He wrote the book in like the 1980s when he's at Stanford. And he basically talks about how do you take an entrepreneurial firm and really scale it and grow it. And then he goes on and writes Built to Last and Good to Great and How the Mighty Fall and Great by Choice and all these other books. And then just a few years ago, he returns to the original Beyond Entrepreneurship and he rewrites it. But when you read the book, he keeps all the old material in the book and those pages are white and the new material is gray. So you get to see how was he thinking about this concept in the late 1980s, and how's he thinking about this concept in essentially 2020. And it's fun to think about, like, well, he was writing about Apple in the 1980s and he's writing about Apple in 2020. What's changed? How is his view? This is just one of an infinite number of examples. How's his view of Steve Jobs changed? So I love that book. And the other book I love, and I think these kind of go together, Danny Meyer is the kind of famous restaurateur in New York City. And Union Square Hospitality Group is the company, and they have all different restaurants at all different price points. And he's the founder of Shake Shack. Shake Shack has since IPO'd, but I think they are the best customer service company in the world. And he's a wonderful entrepreneur. So he wrote a book called Setting the Table, and I love that book. And then about a year and a half ago, one of the general managers for the restaurant that became the best restaurant in the world, it won that award. That general manager, who eventually becomes the owner of that restaurant, Danny Meyer sells it to him, and the head chef, he writes a book called Unreasonable Hospitality. And now I think Unreasonable Hospitality, and that's the author's Will Guidara, that sold more books than Setting the Table. They're both wonderful books, both worth a read. And I got to meet Will Guidara. He keynoted an event that we put on, and he is wonderful. And I love when the general manager writes the book. This is not the chef, like in food culture, right? The chef is the celebrity chef is kind of what we put up on a pedestal. But to have this general manager talk about how they created the best restaurant company in the world, just phenomenal. So I love both of those books. But like you said, I'm always reading something. I always have 2 physical books going, and I have a couple audio books going at all times. So I love to read and kind of be influenced by authors and thought leaders.
Yeah, no, I think those are great suggestions. And of course, no surprise that those books ultimately are about both customer experience and unit economics, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Which kind of is where we started the conversation. So I love the way that reinforces that. And then apart from books, and so with to our audience, whether they're in a franchise business or not, what other advice do you have for folks right now? Again, thinking through the lens of why some businesses scale better than others. What advice do you have, Luke?
Yeah, so my big pieces of advice on what to do to scale, why some companies scale and don't. I really think it's 4 things that I can think of. Number one is it's an intentional decision to scale. I just don't think that you scale out of luck or happenstance. I think there has to be an intentional vision that, hey, this is where we want to go. This is what we want to build. And I actually think there's nothing wrong with not wanting to scale. You can be intentional about that as well. So it's intentional decision and creating this vision of where you want to go. That's number one. Number two, I think the reason companies struggle to scale in all industries is the founder or the entrepreneur can't really face down or stare down the biggest problem or constraints that the business is facing, right? So a specific skill set gets the entrepreneur and gets that business to a certain level, but then you bump up against a wall of this constraint. And instead of solving that constraint, which usually involves learning and then applying and breaking through that constraint, they continue to solve problems at a lower level where they have a level of comfortability with. And that's why the business doesn't scale. And in those cases, you often see that entrepreneur getting into other businesses so they can utilize that same skill set to grow it to a certain level. But they generally will always reach that same constraint, or that constraint within the entrepreneur will become the reason the company doesn't actually scale. So that's number two. Number three is they just don't focus on attracting talented people. I think talented people, the right person, the right seat, however you want to articulate it, is key for scaling. You and I have both been influenced by Dan Sullivan, and he talks about who, not how. You don't have to figure out how to solve all the problems. You have to find the right who that can solve the problem. So just an obsession around finding the right who, and that can be an employee that you hire. It could be a collaboration. It could be a vendor partner, but having the right who's and being on the lookout for the right who's that you want to work synergistically with. And then number four is the kind of the obvious one. It's a cliche, but it's just a lack of process. The processes just have not been stress tested, or when they are stress tested, they just don't hold up.
Wow. That's a lot of good stuff. Luke, thanks again so much. I might even, there might be a reason to get you back on the show at some point. Thanks so much for joining us this time, and I look forward to catching up again soon.
Well, it's my pleasure, Brendon. Thank you so much.